All right, this is week 14. We'll start with chapter 22, the privatization issues in corrections. The chapter starts by looking at history. The use of private facilities for confining offenders isn't new. Went back to England in the Middle Ages. In the 18th century, jailers made their money by charging fees for such services as food and clothing. Reformers like John Howard worked to change the conditions. He recommended classification of prisoners, separation by age, sex, offense seriousness. Also recommended paying jailers a salary rather than running jails based on fees from inmates and their families. In the American colonies, practices similar to those in England existed. Payment was extracted for special services such as better meals, some money given by the government to the jailer for basic services. But it was a widely accepted jailer's practice to charge additional money for special benefits. In some situations, inmates worked for jailers at their farm or business or rented out to the community. In this climate of private exploitation, reforms came in the U.S. Solitary confinement and hard labor were a cornerstone of these new approaches. It led to the penitentiary, where inmates with a strict code of silence lived in separate cells, worked hard, were disciplined with corporal punishment, and had plenty of time to reflect on their mistaken ways and repent. Auburn became the model for U.S. prisons. The silent system, along with a heavy work ethic, became a perfect environment for factories in the prison, which produced all kinds of products. At times, outside companies provided raw materials, which were worked on in prison shops and then sold by the private companies in the community. At other prisons, inmates worked in outside factories, or a prison shop area was rented to a private company, complete with prison labor at a very cheap rate. Other prisons did the entire function, from raw production to finished goods. Prison industries were born, and many private manufacturers made significant profits from the prison labor pool. Not all prison labor in factories. In many states, inmates worked in local stone quarries, gravel pits. At times, prison farm products were sold to the outside community. In addition to renting out shop areas inside prisons or renting out prisoners to work in outside factories, there were instances where the operation of the entire prison was leased to a private contractor. The earliest instance was in 1825 in Kentucky. After the Civil War, states in the South used such leases to private firms or individuals for economic savings. Private firms also rented prison laborers out of regular prisons run by the government. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, leasing of convicts were phased out, even though some practices continued into the 1900s, such as inmates were used on private projects for personal benefits of the warden and sheriff. The work on the prison farm was being done for little or no pay, and the prison labor was being provided for private citizen benefits. What is seen as a pattern of prisons and jails in Anglo-American history is a shift from largely private control in early English jails to a reform period in the 1800s when conditions for inmates were improved. In the penitentiary movement, there were elements of private enterprise pervading prisons in the late 1800s in America, and then a shift to almost total government control and very little private involvement in the 1900s. This history of fluctuating degrees of private involvement isn't a particularly positive one. The rife for abuse, corruption, facilities operated for personal gain rather than a commitment to sound penological goals. Privatization in correction has two parts: contracting for special services and programs, and contracting for the building and operation of the entire correctional facility. In the area of contracting for special services and programs, such as food and health services, it's widely practiced and accepted. In some cases, it might be a matter of necessity, like health care. Contracts with local hospitals may be necessary unless there's a local publicly funded hospital required to take inmate patients. These contracting for services situations pose a special concern for security and supervision of inmates. The contracts have to involve special elements like safety precautions, training, close coordination with other departments in the facility, including security. After the contract performance begin, it needs to be closely monitored to ensure any aspect of performance that threatens security or orderly running of the institution are promptly corrected. And contract termination poses special concerns, like how quickly can it be terminated, what happens to the involved parties during the termination period, and who provides the services after that termination. The second part of privatization in corrections involves whether the operation of the entire correctional facility should be managed by a private company. It's a subject of heated debate. In the 1980s, as of September 2001, there were about 150 private adult correctional facilities in the U.S. Some factors leading to the growth: rapid growth in the prison and jail population, aging of old buildings, and a passage of tougher laws to cope with high crime rates. A need for new jails and prison, operational expenses. Generally when there's a push to lock up more people for longer periods of time, this can increase the cost to the public. And so if you're trying to downsize governmental involvement, this can create some pressure, including political pressure. There's some claimed advantages, like it's cheaper for private corporations to operate the facility. It can get up and running quicker. They're maybe not as bound by government rules and regulations. They can get funds more quickly from private investors or lenders. Basically, it's kind of like a franchise idea that you have a set design, you can prepare and construct quicker, allow government to be more effective and quickly respond to a variation in prison population. There's some concerns. When private prisons take over to conserve funds, they might have a reduced staff. This could raise some security concerns. In a rush to meet deadlines, they could potentially cut corners and reduce quality. It really takes some strict construction contract language and careful monitoring. There are some suspect areas. When you see cost cutting, there might be issues of quality and thus issues of security. There's the hidden nature of many costs, such as capital costs, employee benefits, legal services, insurance, etc. How do these private corporations or trends to privatize save money? Well, typically they are hiring non-unionized labor, they centralize manage it, less involvement in politics and red tape. Might be competition between these companies and governmental contractors. There are some arguments against privatization. If they're a business, they're trying to make a profit, which again, as we mentioned, they may be tempted to cut costs and reduce quality. So the staff might be poorly trained, motivated, educated. They may not even have sufficient experience in operation of a prison. There's some of the skeptics' opinions in terms of the privatization of prisons. There's some legal issues in addition to the cost issues and the political issues we talked about. Is it proper for private entities to exercise the function of confining or punishing citizens? Basically, can a company punish a private citizen, somebody who's in prison? Could they operate in a way where they extend prison sentences in order to get more money to house prisoners, as an example? So would they have the ability, do they have the legal ability to punish prisoners like law enforcement would, put them in solitary confinement, take their privileges away, affect the time of their sentence, as well as parole recommendations, and what happens if they use deadly force in those situations? If they don't, that might be an issue with risk to the public. This can become more of an issue, more of a concern with higher security institutions. For many years, private companies primarily operated in the lower security level institutions. Some states have put limits on this and have had staff who can be contacted in cases of major disturbances, and there has to be some careful training and standards in the area of force, or especially in the areas of potentially deadly force. Contract monitoring is another essential issue. The legal staff has to monitor, take corrective action when necessary, maintain good contractual relationships. There needs to be some provisions in the contracts for sanctions if there's serious abuse, potentially even termination. Use the term tightrope. It's one thing to allow a private vendor to be creative and try new approaches in the process of saving money. On the other hand, there's certain attempts at cost savings that can't be risked for fear of repercussions in the areas of security, safety, health, or protection of the public. Liability is another legal issue. Private companies usually will take out liability insurance as a cost of doing business. Government will usually require a private company to be insured and hold the government harmless for legal claims arising from common law tort actions. The tougher question is the liability of the government to contractors for constitutional violations. So, if the government contracts as a private party to provide these services, and this private party corporation interferes with somebody's constitutional rights, does the government have liability for that? Kind of this idea of an agency. Persons who provide service to inmates under contracts aren't immune from suit for constitutional violations. As we saw in the West v. Atkins 1988 case, officials and staff were running a private prison and jail. They could be sued for constitutional torts under 42 U.S.C. 1983 because they are operating under color of state law. In the McKnight case and the Malesko case, there's two cases in this area. In McKnight, two prison guards working for a private firm claimed entitlement to qualified immunity from inmate lawsuits. McKnight, an inmate in a private prison in Tennessee, alleged that the officer placed him in extremely tight physical restraints, causing a deprivation of his constitutional rights. The Supreme Court ruled that prison guards hired by a private firm are not entitled to qualified immunity. The court saw nothing special about the job or its organizational structure to warrant providing private prison guards with governmental immunity. And here's a quote from the case. The organizational structure is one subject to the ordinary competitive pressures that normally help private firms adjust their behavior in response to the incentives that tort suits provide. Pressures not necessarily present in government departments. So there's a federal equivalent to a 1983 lawsuit in Bivens. In the Malesko case, considered whether a private firm acting under color of federal law may be held liable under Bivens. the Correctional Services Corporation contracted with the federal government to house federal inmates at CSC's New York City halfway house. Malesko, a resident of the house, had a verified heart condition limiting his ability to climb stairs. He was allowed to take the elevator to his fifth-floor room. Although authorized, a CSC employee barred Malesko from using the elevator, requiring him to walk. And he had a heart attack, fell, injured his ear. Several years after that, Malesko sued the CSC and unnamed individual employees, and the statute of limitation barred the suit against individual employees. As to the CSC, the Supreme Court held that the purpose of the Bivens action is to deter the officer, not the agency. That private firms operating under color of federal law are not subject to liability under Bivens suits. Whether such liability should exist was seen by the court as a question for Congress to address. The court further noted that Malesko had not been without remedies. He had both the Bureau of Prisons grievance procedures and a possible remedy in tort, where he could have alleged negligence on the part of the CSC staff. In both Richardson and indirectly in the CSC case, the Supreme Court recognized that private prison staff are not immune from litigation alleging constitutional violations. As to the overriding question, does the government have the authority to contract away a government function? The Supreme Court hasn't addressed that yet. Some general comments. A delegation of authority by the executive agencies at the federal and state level usually have been upheld. What's not allowed is a delegation of legislative or judicial functions. Contracting away functions is probably legally supportable on some levels, such as management of services like food and health. The states have allowed private parties to perform law enforcement functions, such as in the case of private security police. Confining persons in jail or prison is a different matter. At least in recent times, this has been considered a function of the government alone, and it will probably need to be litigated in each jurisdiction. For now, it's best to have the legislative authority to delegate these functions to private parties. In terms of delegation of routine rulemaking, record keeping, assigning inmates to housing, etc., this could be upheld as a delegated function. But delegation of rulemaking decisions on inmate discipline may be one in which the court says private contractors may not take over the government function, because this would be an approach in the nature of legislative or adjudicative functions. Rules that cross over into the outlining the consequences for breaking rules may even go into this area, and it has some implications in the area of constitutional protections and due process. The contracting for operation of a lower security detention facility seems defensible, provided there's statutory authority to contract, and the contracts are carefully drawn up and monitored. There's a provision for disciplinary action to be taken by government corrections staff, or at least supervise. The operation of higher security prisons is more problematic. We need to assess the ability of the private corrections corporation to perform at that level. And then there's still the issue of deadly force. With time, private facility staff will gain more experience in dealing with inmates. Whether the Supreme Court will ultimately uphold private operation of high security prisons remains an open question.